So hello everyone and welcome to the video. Recently ICH has released the ICH-GCP E6R3 Annexure 2 update, and these are very significant update because they tackle more critical issues which are clearly moving the clinical trials and adapting to the latest digital technology and changes in laws and regulation related to clinical trial and how modern technology is being adapted to the guidelines. So make sure you watch this video till the end so that you can understand all the updates, all the changes, and you are well aware of what is happening in the industry. So make sure you subscribe to the channel as we bring you such quality information content. Without further ado, let's start. So first and foremost, let us understand what exactly or when exactly was Annexure 2 released. So Annexure 2 was released on adopted by the ICH Expert Working Committee on the 3rd June of 2026. Okay, so right this month. Okay, and this particular document is not only another update in ICH guidelines, but it clearly states the standards for modern clinical trial. You have to understand that the clinical research industry is shifting from traditional clinical trial towards more modern clinical trial, which includes a lot of model elements such as electronic healthcare requirement, electronic informed consent, the real world data applications. Okay, and also of course integrating elements which are AI enabled. Okay, so this particular Annexure 2 update was brought because it was answering or responding to the growing use of decentralized clinical trial, the pragmatic elements that are used in clinical research, followed by the real world data and the methodologies that are being used for clinical trials worldwide. Okay, so a lot of clinical trials are using modern technology, but there needs to be clear guidelines on how to use this technology and what are the integration aspects. Now, to understand the scope of this particular update, then this particular update complements the previously released E6R3, which was released last year, and it adds to it. It adds the additional GCP consideration for modern clinical trial design as well as the data sources used in clinical trial. But you have to understand that this is not an exhaustive iteration. It is an iteration which is designed to evolve with evolving new technologies and methodologies that can be adopted in line with the local regulatory requirement of that particular country. Okay, so whenever you conduct a clinical trial, it is not only about what technologies or methodologies is used by that particular country, but we also have to look at what exactly the global ICH guidelines say. Okay, so let us understand what exactly are the key elements and important updates in Annexure 2. So the first important element is decentralized trial elements. Now, what do you mean by that? So any trial related activities that are conducted outside investigator's location. Okay, and which are these locations? It can be a participant's home. Okay, it can be a local health center. Okay, it can be medical mobile units and remote digital interactions. Okay, so as you know that it is no longer mandatory for the subject or clinical trial volunteer to come to principal investigator. There are aspect of the clinical trial which allows you to visit the participant's home, local health center, mobile medical units can be deployed, as well as remote digital interaction are allowed. And this particular shift is decentralizing the clinical trial element. Now we are moving from a single site to directly patient centric elements which are decentralized in nature. Okay, now that is the definition of decentralized trial elements. Now how these particular elements are used? So they are basically used in digital health technologies. And to cover this digital health technology, what do you exactly mean by DHTs? So this is a broad term covering your mobile apps, your wearables, your sensors, which is used to collect, measure and monitor the health data. Okay, so whenever we speak about digital health technologies, we refer to these apps, wearable and sensor. And whenever these tools are used to acquire any kind of participant data which needs to be classified as a data acquisition tool. Okay, Now this particular decentralized elements focus on the remote visit which are done via video calls, and the DHTs, that is technologies, are now explicitly used within the scope of GCP. Okay, so if you are performing any kind of video call or remote visit, then that particular remote visit with the use of DHTs should come in scope of GCP, and GCP will clearly state what kind of activities you can perform, how the patient data is supposed to be masked, what are the elements that are to be included in this remote calls. Okay, the next aspect is the IP. Now the GCP also states about the IP which can directly be shipped towards the participant's home or local health center. Okay, so now as we are moving towards patient-centered clinical trial, it is very imperative to make sure that the IP reaches to the subject and subject doesn't miss his particular medication. And the methodologies, the guidelines for IP shipment towards the subject's home or local health center will clearly help us in understanding this decentralized element. Okay, next thing would be the investigator oversight. Now the investigator oversight is not only limited to the physical visit by the study volunteers, but also the guidelines for video, telephonic, and email records. Okay, and how are they proportionate? Okay, so wherever it is required to have video call or telephonic visit, you need to have appropriate records, and this particular guidelines also tells us how they should be taken. Okay, last but not the least, the participant familiarity with the technology must be considered. Okay, on paper and in person, falling back wherever required, wherever feasible, which means that now that we are moving into an digital era where the remote visit would be preferred by the study volunteers, but it does not mean that you force this particular digital methods on them. If they are not comfortable, then there needs to be elements, there needs to be provision where this digital technology can be paper based also as required by the participant, and you require a in-person fallback option where they can move from the modern option to your traditional option. Okay, so that is about the decentralized trial element which are spoken in annexure 2. Next aspect is pragmatic trial elements. Now, what are pragmatic trial elements? So, elements which integrate aspect of the usual clinical practice into the clinical trial design and conduct. Okay. Now, whenever you determine the eligibility criteria and the process that reflect your routine care settings in your hospitals, GPs, and healthcare centers that are to be integrated into the clinical trial. Okay. Again, whenever we conduct clinical trial, we have to be pragmatic and we have to streamline the data collection method where you capture only the minimum necessary data. Okay, and that particular data need to be aligned with routine care timing. Okay, so whenever you conduct a clinical trial, you have to ensure that the pragmatic elements are implemented, and now the GCP also accommodates this particular pragmatic elements, stating that any electronic health records or automated data export can support the streamlined data collection. Okay, so data collection is a part of clinical trial, but the transmission of the data, the streamlining of that particular data into the electronic healthcare records needs to be required as per GCP. Again, your protocol needs to address that. It must clearly describe how the data will be collected, who will collect it, and under what circumstances this pragmatic activity shall be performed. Okay, so there should be a clear description of all those activity in your protocol itself, and the sponsor must also assess the fit for purpose application of this particular pragmatic element in your regulatory compliance as well as each pragmatic element defined in the protocol. So that is about the pragmatic trial elements. Now, the next big topic is the real world data or RWD in clinical trial. Now, if you talk about real world data, there are various aspects to it and various places where you can collect this particular data. So the traditional method would be the EHR, okay, the electronic health records, followed by the claims from the administrative claims department. Next thing would be the registry, where the registry will share you the data about the potential subject, and the digital health technology where you collect the data from the wearables and sensors. Now, how this particular data is included in clinical trial? First and foremost, you have to understand the fit for purpose elements. Okay, so each and every sponsor must assess the relevance of that particular data. Which key data elements are available? How is that reliable? How about its accuracy, completeness, traceability of this particular real world data? Okay, so how it is fit for your purpose. Next thing would be the access to the source record. Okay, so for high criticality cases, like for example, to determine your key efficiency or safety endpoint, and to access the individual level source record required for QA, QC, and regulatory inspection. So using RWD is one aspect of it, but to access that particular record should be clearly defined in your protocol, in your consent itself. Okay. Next thing would be the data linkage. Now, multiple real world data sources can be used, but they need to be linked. Okay. So the EHR claims, mortality, they need to be clubbed together, and this particular linkage methodologies and inconsistency should be resolved by pre-specified parameters in the protocol. Okay, so if you are using real world data elements in clinical trial, then that there needs to be a clear description of what portals, what kind of data will be used, and how we are going to process the same, and that is defined in the protocol itself. Next thing would be the consent and permission. So you are using various data from various real world sources, but appropriate consent from the ethics committee approval needs to be taken before using the real world data, and a broad consent or waiver must apply depending upon the regional requirement of clinical trial conducted in that country. Okay, so you can collect the data with various aspect of RWD, but it should not override the permissions or the data that you are going to collect before consenting the ethics committee as well as the local regulatory agencies. Okay, so that is about the application of RWD as per Annexure 2. Next thing would be the new consideration for informed consent. Now, this is a big area because as we are moving towards digital consent, there has to be a clear guideline which defines the informed consent. So, as per Annexure section 2.2.1 regarding remote consent, so it clearly states in GCP in Annexure 2 that the consent may be obtained remotely. An investigator has the responsibility to verify the participant identity through an official ID via the video call. Okay, and this particular verification method should enhance the privacy safeguard, and that needs to be pre-specified in your protocol, in your consent document. Okay, so you can perform remote consent, but how do you perform that? Which particular IDs are required? Okay, how the privacy should be taken care of, that is clearly defined in Annexure 2, followed by the technology fallback. Okay, so when the computerized system are used, participant can be offered the paper-based system as a in-person alternative. Okay, so it doesn't mean that for your convenience itself you are forcing digital informed consent. Okay, on video call, participants should be given an option to fall back on in-person paper-based methods also, and wherever it is feasible you should apply appropriate methodologies for taking consent. Okay, and that has to account the population characteristic and digital literacy also. Okay, so if there is a senior citizen who is not friendly towards the video calls, okay, they are skeptical towards the digital consent, so they should be given an option to visit in person, to meet the doctors, to sign on paper consent also. Okay, so that is about the technology fallback. Next thing would be data disclosure. So all the consent materials must describe what kind of patient data will be collected, how it will be used, where it will be processed, and which parties will have access to that data, including the home nurses which will visit to the subject, the logistical providers, what kind of data will the subject be exposed to. Okay, next thing would be the RWD consent. Okay, so how the real world data consent, or how the real world data will be collected. Consent must cover the access to real world data sources, which particular records will be accessed, and that has to be approved by the regulatory agency, the sponsor representative, and the IRB and IEC. And broad consent or IRB waiver must apply to secondary use of data. Okay, so whenever it comes to use of real world data or real world data application in informed consent, it needs to be clearly defined in the protocol and the consent form itself, and there needs to be targeted consenting as well as a broad consent to clearly define where this particular data will be collected, used and applied, and whether secondary data applications are there, that has to be also clearly defined. Now coming on to another broad topic, which is regarding the IP management. So whenever you perform IP management, there are elements such as supply and dispatch, receipt and verification of the IP, that is investigational product, storage and administration, and finally return and accountability. Okay, so the GCP clearly states how direct to patient shipping will be done. Okay, how IP will be shipped to participants home by which particular investigator or institution. Okay, how it will be acceptable to the regulatory authority, and how investigator authorization is required before shipment. Okay, so you not only dispense the IP, it is the responsibility of the investigator when the subject needs which particular IP, and it will be under his vigilance. Next thing would be the blinding and privacy. Now we are shipping this particular IP to the participant, and there is a middle part where the couriers would be involved. Then the shipping must clearly protect the subject PII and HI, which means that the personally identifiable information, okay, and how they protect blinding also. Again, the confidentiality of the subject's identity, the disease status of the subject. So the privacy becomes at the forefront, and Annexure 2 addresses the privacy safeguards which are needs to be documented. Again, next aspect is related to investigator responsibility. So even when the sponsor arranges the shipment, okay, it is the responsibility of the investigator or the institution for the safety of the subject for appropriate use of the IP. So the oversight of the IP use, application and shipment shall be on the principal investigator who is conducting the clinical trial at that particular institution or the hospital. Next thing would be the existing pharmacy record. So even if the sponsor is shipping the IP directly to the patient, it does not mean that the investigator is not supposed to keep the pharmacy record. Standard pharmacy practices of accountability and shipment will still apply, and whenever there is routine audit and monitoring, you need to keep those particular record to clearly determine whether the IP is in sufficient quantities depending upon the regulatory requirements and patient use. Okay, so IP and modern decentralized element of clinical trial like shipping the medicine to directly to the subject is also being addressed in Annexure 2. Now, while summing up the takeaways, you need to understand that this particular Annexure 2 focuses on the decentralized clinical trials and addresses the remote visit, the application of DHT, how the home-based IP shall be shipped to the subject, and it also clearly expands the scope of GCP over the oversight and privacy elements associated with it. Again, the pragmatic elements have been addressed into the protocol itself, and the requirement of responsibility to various stakeholders and maintaining data integrity, and again various elements of real world data is also being addressed. Last but not the least, these particular updates in Annexure 2 clearly defines the proportionate risk strategy, where the oversight of the investigator, sponsor, and data governance team is taken into consideration, and the criticality of the participant data and potential risk is clearly being defined. Again, this particular annexure clearly defines that the ICH is focusing on privacy first, where there are requirements for cybersecurity safeguard, confidentiality protection, and data breach risk management are being taken care of. And last but not the least, whatever updates we have discussed, these are clear indication of evolving guidance. Annexure 2 is moving towards modern and digital clinical trials, and they are also taking care of the local regulatory authority and how that can be integrated into the global clinical trial ecosystem as well as complementing the local clinical trial. So thank you for watching this video till the end. Please make sure that you subscribe to the channel and make sure you support us moving forward. Thank you.